by way of recap, which you guys know I like to do, thus far we have really talked about and established how Paul ended up in Philippi, the journey that led him to be there. We moved on to talking about his imprisonment, 4 years, not 4 years there, but the imprisonment that led up to the writing of this letter. And during the course of his imprisonment, he wrote it. We know it was 2 years with Herod, and then 2 years kind of on house arrest, if you will, as he awaits time before Caesar. We talked about the fact that this is a very personal letter. He is so grateful to the church there at Philippi for the support that he's received along the way, even during his imprisonment. And he was so pleased with them in the way that they were growing in their maturity, and then just encouraging them to continue in their maturing as Christians, which we'll begin to get into not today, but beginning next week. We're going to get into kind of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of this epistle, where he's talking about ways that they can mature in Christ. So last week we started talking about the portion of the letter where he's really speaking about his circumstances, the circumstances that surrounded his ministry. And then, as we're going to see today, there were some circumstances that kind of led to him having a dilemma, if you will, that he was struggling, even though it was briefly, he was definitely dealing with. So the circumstances that surrounded his ministry that he had to look at, and he kind of reflected upon, almost from bad versus good tones, if you will. Number one was his imprisonment. He kind of had a little bit of a bad, if you will, tone around that, because he was imprisoned. He was concerned that it was going to be an imposition to his ministry and disrupt it. Nevertheless, he stayed very positive, as we read and saw, and that led to the good. The gospel continued to prosper, even through him, as he ministered and studied and had people coming and going that he was dealing with, and others around were spreading the gospel as well. Then number three, kind of the fact that he was under constant observation and scrutiny. In a way, it was bad, but we know that it led to number four, that the gospel was ultimately going to reach even as high as Caesar, which we will eventually get to in chapter 4 of Philippians. And then number five, as we said, many men were preaching. Many people were spreading the gospel. That was a good thing. It was continuing to persevere despite his incarceration. But number six, some were preaching out of spite and kind of from a contentious position, a jealous position, an envious position, as we talked about the fact that Paul had become very well known by this point and was famous, if you will. And so a lot of people were looking to cause envy and strife in Paul, because he wasn't able to go and do and see all the people in person that he might have wanted to. And that they were possibly trying to even make him feel like they were feeling, which was jealous of his renown and the way that he was received in different places and things like that. And then number seven, despite all of that, he didn't give in to that. He just was glad that the gospel was being proclaimed and that there was a real perseverance in the spreading of the gospel. So, and then as you remember last week, I kind of got into talking about some personal things that I shared with you about focusing on the importance of seeking God's will in our lives, looking for His plans. And as we've seen through a lot of the things that we've covered, Paul really did this while asking for clarity and through eyes of faith. He was looking for what was best for the gospel and for the kingdom in the things that he was dealing with, and that's what helped him to remain in a joyous posture despite all the things that he was facing. And so it was really last week we kind of closed with some focus around that, and it's going to continue to be laced into the rest of our class as we look and strive to finish kind of this section today, looking at the rest of what we were originally trying to get through, which was through verse 26. So we don't have a lot of scripture to cover today, but there's really kind of a lot to talk about around these scriptures as we kind of get to a natural break, if you will, before we get into the different ways we can emulate Christ and the ways that we can strive to grow in our maturity. So that kind of brings us back to where we are. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to focus and going to see this continue, that we're going to really be charged with and seeing things with eyes of faith as we pray for clarity and look for clarity in what we're doing individually and as we're striving to grow spiritually, but also as a body of believers that meet here together, what we can do to look for the things that God might have us to do as a group. So there we go. Back to lesson 3. Again, we're going to be, originally I think I put last night on my little reminder group me post, and I might have put 21 through 26, but we're actually going to look at verse 20 again today. So let's take a look at this. We see that he's finished speaking kind of about the good and the bad circumstances that surrounded things that might help or hinder his ministry. And now, as I mentioned, he's kind of to this point where he's looking at it from the stand. There's kind of this dilemma that he's being faced with. And so let's take a look at that. So when we look at verse 21, it's really important, like I mentioned, for us to really kind of back up to verse 20. So let's do that first. Philippians 1:20 reads, "According to my earnest expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness Christ will even now, as always, be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death." And then into 21, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." So I backed up because even though I went through 20 last week, these two verses really kind of go together. Not kind of, they go together. And it's interesting that in my Bible, and I think when I looked at Dawn's, and probably a lot of y'all's, there's actually kind of sometimes a subheading. If you have one of those Bibles that has section breaks and man-made subtitles or section headings, there'll be something in there that kind of breaks 20 to 21. But these clearly go together. In 20, he's really stating that whether he lives, and I'm going to back up, whether he lives or dies, he really just wants to honor Christ. That is of paramount importance to him, and that's really what he's saying in this verse. But then when we move into 21, as simple and short as it is, he is simply saying that his preference would actually be to die and to be with Christ. And, that's a pretty profound place to be, right? I know we all want to be there, and that's the ultimate goal. But for him, he's been in the presence of Christ. He knows what's awaiting him. He's heard firsthand and knows this man and knows his Savior personally, and so he has this desire to really to be with him. That's what he would choose on the face of it. So let's continue in verse 22. Verse 22 starts, "But if I am to live in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. But I am hard-pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet, to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake." And I think this goes with what you were just saying, Alex, because clearly, when you go back to 21, that simple verse, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." So he sees clearly that if he is to live on, it will be for the betterment of Christ and the kingdom. That is going to require, as we see in 22 through 24, he is acknowledging, he knows that it is going to be a fruitful labor. It will be something that he knows is going to continue to take a lot of effort on his part, but it's going to be fruitful labor. But of course, for him, he sees it as gain to be able to go and be with Christ again in the place that was promised. And so, he, despite the circumstances that he's been faced with, he sees the situation in a very positive light, really, no matter what happens. And that's, again, seeing this through eyes of faith. On the one hand, if he is freed, as we're talking about here, he looks forward to being very active in his ministry. He'll be in the capital of the world, as we talked about last week, in this place and in this time where it will be just this awesome ability to be freed and to immediately embark upon spreading the gospel and telling everybody the good news of Christ. And there's a lot of interest there. I mean, he will, of course, as we see in chapter 4, he will indeed get the opportunity to speak to Caesar and his family. He's also already had a lot of influence on the Praetorian Guard, as we spoke about last week. These very influential men that are in the military and in and around the area, and of course guarding him. But as we said, there's also a lot of Jews that are already there that have been converted when he first arrived, and we back in Acts 28. We see that there were a lot already converted before we get to this point, and likewise, there's many Christians in Rome also there in Acts 28. So, it just seems to me, and of course this is my speculation or just my thought, trying to think about if I were in his situation, I would be excited about the prospect of getting out of this incarceration that's been limiting me, even though the gospel has prospered, because he's been relegated to writing letters and sending messages with people, and you just can see in the things that he's done and that have led to this point, he's a doer, right? And he probably, I would want to get out and see people in person like we're able to do here today, and I would imagine he's excited about that prospect, and just the ability to directly impact the growth of the kingdom, despite the fact that there are many other people that want to do it and are participating in it as well. And then, of course, as we were talking about, he mentions that other option, right, that he could be executed, and he doesn't mention and really focus on the actual act or the thought of his being put to death. Instead, he really focuses on the fact that it would just be a good thing in his eyes to go and be with Christ. Would be a different kind of freedom, is the way it seems like. I get the feel here that again, through eyes of faith, if that was the thing that happened to him, it would indeed be a different kind of freedom. To be eternally with Christ in heaven would absolutely be the gain. It would be his personal desire. And for him, he believes it would actually be better for him. And in fact, here he says, very much better. It's not just that it would be, that'd be all right too. It's like it would be absolutely, the ultimate to be able to go and be with Christ. Imagine, he could say something bold and absolutely true and say it in a manner that would fly in the face of Caesar or any of these other people in between him and Caesar, and end his ministry, and he could still be proud of everything he said, knowing that it was true, but it would be in the way and the boldness or the things that he could say. And I told you guys, whether it was last week or the week before or maybe both, that it's my desire, and we've been even talking as a family, that I want to be more bold for Christ in the ways that I reach out to people, and whether it's praying with somebody in public or whatever the case may be. But just imagine the level of boldness he already has by saying, you know what, put me in front of Caesar back when he was in Herod's prison. I'm not going to, you need to move me here. And just the way things have gone for him, he's already obviously very bold and that's probably why he was so renowned, because he was absolutely not afraid to proclaim the gospel or even go to prison for it, and certainly not to put himself before the person who could ultimately end his life. So I think that's just such a great point, because we're going to get to talking about how we make our decisions, and so yeah, absolutely, he was in a place where he could have had it either way, and it absolutely wouldn't have been anything like suicide. It would have been someone taking his life from him for the cause, for the sake of the faith. Good point. So he's not focused on any of his personal needs, or his desire to take a break, or to get to rest, or to any of his personal needs. He's just not worried about that, or whether or not he's going to have time to do it. That's just not a factor. That's a great point. We get so caught up on the things that get in our way from being together more, or going out and figuring out a way to reach out beyond the doors, or whatever the case may be. Even things that I know this week I let things get in my way of other things that I probably should have been doing, and that were more important to this. So that's a great point. Okay, so when he describes the way that he's kind of settled the matter in his own heart, he knows that being with Christ would serve him best. He, at the end, the suffering and the demands of the ministry, all of these different things, remaining would serve the church best. And that's ultimately where he does land. Let's take a look and kind of rejoin it in verse 25. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. So, he's telling them, he's convinced that remaining and ministering to them to grow and encourage their faith is much more necessary, and this is what is going to take place. It's not a prophecy. It's just he's stating, that given the two options, as we talked about, and him having some control over that he is convinced, as far and as much as he can possibly know as a mere mortal, as just a man can possibly be sure, he is sure that remaining to serve the church is the better option, and is absolutely what's going to happen. He even looks ahead and describes the situation when he would finally come back to them and physically be among them once again. His presence will strengthen their faith. His presence will bring joy to them. His presence will enable them to be even bolder in proclaiming the gospel. And so he is really, really focused on this. He describes his present condition and the future hope of his release to encourage them in this letter. So he's literally envisioning a time when he can be back with them and have a positive impact on their spiritual development. Any other, so at this point, thoughts, questions, observations? All right, good deal. I think it's, as we said, this is another one of those places where there's kind of this natural break. And I really wanted to take some time to focus on some of the lessons, even from just these few short scriptures, and some of them we've already talked about. The things that we see up to this point that have been really involved in Paul's decision making and in his ministry and even in his imprisonment, and that is the first lesson that I really have been kind of hitting on all through. Number one, we know the dilemma was settled, that being with Christ would serve Paul, staying and ministering would serve the church. And as we talked about, trying to focus our lives in this world that we live in now is sometimes so difficult. We come here on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings, and then a lot of times we don't see each other, we don't talk to each other. We might have some group me chatter in between, And that is so far from what they were doing, as we talked about even in Kenny's sermon last week, where they were just together continually. And while we know that might not be, and I say might not, in our current situation, in our current circumstances, it's not possible for us to be with each other 24/7. Sell all of our possessions and throw them in together for the tending to one another's needs and those types of things. It's just we're kind of not in that position to do that. But as we look to do more work for God and for Christ and for the kingdom, I think that I see some opportunities for us to grow together and to be together more and to do things that will exalt Him and that will magnify the kingdom. And I think we have to be in that place where we want to do that. And that first lesson really comes to us doing, and we talked about it last week, striving to see life through eyes of faith. As we're looking for opportunities, we know that Paul did this. He looked at all of those different things, the bad and the good, and the circumstances around his ministry. And then even as he faced this dilemma, he saw his situation through eyes of faith. And even as he came to the dilemma of which way to go and which way to try to push it, to influence it one way or the other, again, really through eyes of faith for him to reconcile that this was good for him individually versus staying and persevering in the ministry, persevering in the faith, was a situation that was so much better for the kingdom. Without faith, his condition made no sense, if you think about it. I mean, he was in prison. He was put in there without actually having official charges levied against him. He was wrongly accused in the first place. His ministry was interrupted. It was just corrupt politicians all around him. But through eyes of faith, he could see God working the whole time, as we kind of saw all the way down to that number 7 point, that despite all of these things, he continued to rejoice that the gospel was prospering. And even in ways he couldn't imagine, and even in ways where these some of the other people were going out and trying to do it from positions of pride and envy and trying to cause strife and cause problems for Paul, he still saw that, the gospel will not return empty. As long as the gospel and the true gospel is being proclaimed, it's going to be okay. That, at the end of the day, is better for the kingdom, for people to hear about it, even though these folks are doing it from a position of ill intent. So, I do think that it's something that, as I'm thinking about my own prayer life, and sometimes the laundry list of things that I ask God to do and ask Him for, and even in times where I've been faced with the possibility of an interruption in my employment, or we've been dealing with profound sickness or illness, we of course, and very faithful that He will answer our prayer, because we know that it will be answered one way or the other. I focus on what I want, or what I think is best for Dawn and Blaine and Mona, and I don't use the filter of what does he need me to do, or where does he need me to be, and that type of thing, as often as I should. I have in the past tried to really have that filter, the eyes of faith, for me to have the clarity. But it's something that I personally am trying to incorporate into my personal prayer life, and I just think maybe you guys are different. Maybe you have that in there in every single prayer that you pray. But I think we do often neglect to pray through eyes of faith, that we can just see exactly what He's needing us to do from God's perspective. It may not change the situation itself, but it can change us. And the way that we come out of that prayer, and the way that we open our eyes and embrace everything around us, and whether or not we see those paths that have been laid before us the way that He would want us to see them. And so I think that's something that is a good takeaway lesson for me personally, and hopefully for you guys as well. Any thoughts on this first one? There's a second one that I see in the block that we've covered this far. But all right. So the second lesson is, how do Christians choose between right and right? I think that as children, we begin and clearly are taught right from wrong. We know that if we do this, this is going to happen, and we clearly begin to know, my parents have told me this is wrong, I better not do this. I need to make the decision to do right versus wrong. And then that is through our whole lives, right? We're presented with the opportunity each and every day to make the right choice or the wrong choice so often. It doesn't matter whether it's the speed limit, right, or whatever. We are faced with, and we clearly don't generally have a problem understanding this is wrong and this is right, and leaning to the right versus leaning to doing the wrong thing. However, think about, again, the choice that Paul was presented with here. He could die and go and be with Jesus. And he could also stay and work really hard and persevere and spread the gospel and train so many other people, help prop up so many churches, help correct churches as they have wayward moments, help bring up new evangelists, help install elders and deacons in church. All these things, he just, as we know from the Word, he ends up doing all of these things right and right. And I think it's almost kind of like, if you will, the negative feedback loop when you look at these two lessons, right? One sends it back to the other, right? Because how we can choose when we're faced with two what seem like good situations is to, again, filter it through eyes of faith like Paul did, and looking at what, though they were both good decisions that were going to be right, if you will, one was right for the kingdom, one was right for the cause of Christ above what was absolutely right for him as a man, as a faithful man. And so I think that, again, one can continue to filter us back to the other, lesson 1 to lesson 2. They can just be that continuous loop that leads from one decision to the next. It's again easy to pick the right answer when one of them is so clearly wrong, but and there's different opportunities that we do get faced with where there is indeed a couple of what appear to be really good decisions that you could make here, and both of them seem positive. And so adding that layer of being prayerful for clarity and through eyes of faith, I believe will help us to ultimately pick what's best for God's plan for us, and will help us to really and truly see the clarity around the paths that he's already laid down before us. So, that's just the two key lessons that I pick up from where we're at so far.